Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Nurse Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our video. After a supposed down week of college football, there wasn't a lot of great games. But lo and behold, week 4 is going to be absolutely insane with the amount of games that there were. But even with the down schedule in week 3, there were still some upsets and a lot of results that are going to have big implications as we go down the road during the season and get closer and closer to the bowl games and the college football playoff. But I'm going to get into this week's AP Top 25 poll and give my thoughts of where each team is ranked. Georgia's number 1 still, and as you can see, they have 57 of the first place votes, which is the vast majority of them. And they beat a South Carolina team by 10 points this past week at home. That wasn't a super impressive win, but they still were able to beat a solid conference foe. And the teams behind them, none of them really were able to do anything that could possibly supplant Georgia for that spot. The only way Georgia would have fell is if they lost that game. That just wasn't the case. So for now, Georgia will remain the number 1 team in college football, and deservedly so, until they lose or someone knocks them off that spot with a more impressive win. Michigan last week, they beat Bowling Green, and again, they were solid in that game. Jim Harbaugh was not able to coach in this game as well. He's going to be back for their game against Rutgers next week, which you would think Michigan should easily be able to win, but you never want to overlook an opponent. As we've seen, a lot of teams had a lot of close calls this past week because they possibly were looking ahead to some great showdowns in week 4 of college football. But Michigan took care of business, even if they weren't super impressive, but they stay at number 2. Texas moves up to number 3 after they beat the Wyoming Cowboys. They struggled in the first half against Wyoming, but they pulled away in the second half. And because Florida State had an even worse performance, the AP voters barely put Texas at number 3 by a couple of points. Then you look at Florida State falling to number 4. A win is a win, and at the end of the day, this close encounter against Boston College is not going to hurt their playoff resume because they fell 1 spot. As long as Florida State takes care of business this season and at the most only has 1 loss, they would have a really good shot to make the playoff. But for Florida State, was this a classic case of looking ahead to your next opponent? Because the Seminoles have Clemson on the road next week, and that's going to be one of the best games of the week for slate in college football, along with a lot of other great games. And Florida State has a legitimate shot to lose or win that game. They are a really solid team, but they did not look like it against Boston College. And Florida State's going to have to look more like the team against LSU if they want to have a really good chance to continue to keep winning, especially against Clemson on the road next week. But I understand why Florida State fell a spot, because that performance against Boston College was poor. But a win is a win, and the Seminoles avoided disaster. USC is at number 5. They had a bye, so they do not move anywhere. Ohio State at number 6, and they almost actually supplanted USC for the 5th spot because the Buckeyes finally had a dominating performance. They blew out Western Kentucky. And Western Kentucky's not necessarily an awful team. So that was a great look for Ohio State. And maybe it's finally showing that the Buckeyes are getting on the right track. Penn State's at number 7, and they won at Illinois last week. And the Nittany Lions, they did not move up a spot in the AP poll, but they did not move down either because their win was impressive enough to not get supplanted by a team that was behind them. Illinois is not a bad team. They are struggling a bit, but Penn State was still able to get a solid road win. Washington's at number 8, and they shellacked Michigan State on the road last week. Some would argue that Washington should have supplanted Penn State, but Michigan State's a worse team than Illinois, and even though Washington blew them out, there's only so much the AP voters can do when every team ahead of them looks solid as well. So Washington, keep doing what you're doing, and you'll be okay. They got a pretty easy date with Cal next weekend. Don't want to overlook any opponent, but Washington looking good right now and deserves to be in the top 10. Notre Dame's at number 9 last week. They beat Central Michigan. That was not the greatest win in the world, but it was impressive enough for them not to move out of the top 10. And Notre Dame has a massive showdown with Ohio State coming up this week in South Bend. That's going to be a big game for Notre Dame. If they can beat Ohio State, that would really help them move up in the rankings, where if Ohio State loses, especially if they don't perform too well, could maybe fall out of the top 10. But that's going to be a big measuring stick between those two teams on who is possibly going to move up or down these rankings. Oregon's at number 10. Last week, they beat Hawaii. There's not much else to be said. The Ducks moved up because other teams lost, and they were really solid against the Rainbow Warriors. Utah's at number 11, and they beat Weber State last week. Utah was not able to win that game by enough to pass Oregon in the rankings, but still was a solid win for Utah, and they keep moving up because other teams are taking casualties. But now Utah's got a tough matchup with UCLA coming up this week. If Cam Rising could return, that would be huge for the Utes because they're just not as good of a team without him. I still think Utah has a good shot to possibly win without Cam Rising, but that's going to be a game that Utah really needs to win if they want to move into the top 10 of the rankings. LSU's at number 12, and they move up 2 spots after beating Mississippi State on the road last week. The Bulldogs were awful. Even with the Cowbells at home, they're not the same team without Mike Leach. Again, rest in peace to the great Mike Leach. Unfortunately for the Bulldogs, they had no chance against LSU, and the Tigers maybe are going to get some momentum back to be able to help them boost themselves back up into the top 10. They've got a pesky Arkansas team at home coming up this week, but Arkansas did lose to BYU in week 3. Alabama fell to number 13, and this is the lowest we have seen the Alabama Crimson Tide in a long time. And yes, they won last week, but the AP voters were not impressed with them beating South Florida on the road 17-3. They looked awful in that game, and it took a touchdown in the final minute of the game to ice it. Alabama was not comfortable in this game at all. There was a rain delay, but still, old Alabama would have won by 50 points more than likely with Nick Saban. The Crimson Tide have a lot of things they need to figure out, and they have a really tough game against Ole Miss in Tuscaloosa coming up in week 4. Another great showdown. If Alabama plays like they did against South Florida, they're going to have a really tough time beating the Rebels, and if they do lose, Alabama will fall even further in these rankings, and it will be the lowest that Alabama has been in the AP poll in around 10 years, but I definitely understand why they fell to number 13 because their performance against South Florida was definitely not top 10 worthy. Oregon State's at number 14. They beat San Diego State handily last week. They've got a tough date with Washington State on the road this week. The Pac-12's got a lot of great showdowns. The week 4 slate in college football is going to be one of the best weeks of the entire season. As Josh Pate would say, you don't want to schedule a wedding during this week of college football because there's going to be some classics this week, and this is another one of those games that might even fall under the radar with the bigger games like Ole Miss, Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Florida State, Clemson. But again, Oregon State at Washington State is no slouch, but if the Beavers can beat the Cougars on the road, that would really help out Oregon State's chances of getting closer and closer to the top 10. But the Beavers deserve the number 14 spot because they looked really impressive last week, even if it was against a mediocre San Diego State team. Ole Miss is at number 15. They beat Georgia Tech this past week. It wasn't the most impressive win in the world, but they took care of business, and they've got Alabama in Bryant-Denny Stadium. And this is not the Alabama of old. Lane Kiffin's licking his chops. He wants to knock off his former boss really badly, and Ole Miss will have a really good shot of doing that, especially if they play a high-quality game. But if Ole Miss can beat Alabama, it would definitely propel them toward the top 10, and I think that number 15 right now is fair for the Rebels. Oklahoma's at number 16, and they destroyed Tulsa last week on the road. Oklahoma did what you would have thought Alabama would have done at South Florida, taking care of business very easily. Dylan Gabriel threw for 5 touchdowns, and Oklahoma had some defense. They forced 5 turnovers on the Golden Hurricanes. I think that Oklahoma deserves to move back up a little bit in these rankings after that performance, even if it was against a team like Tulsa. North Carolina's at number 17, and they bounced back a little bit in these rankings. After having a sluggish performance against App State, they turned around and beat Minnesota fairly handily. Drake May threw for over 400 yards. He had a couple picks. He has been a bit more turnover prone this year, but Drake May's still a really talented quarterback, and I do feel like North Carolina deserves to move up few spots in these rankings for that solid win over Minnesota. They do have at Pitt next week. That's going to be an underrated game with all of these great top 25 matchups in college football in week 4. That game might go under the radar a bit, especially because Pitt does not like a great team this year, but it's always tough in Heinz Field. North Carolina can't overlook the Pittsburgh Panthers, or they could fall out of the top 25 just as quickly as they entered it at the beginning of this season. Duke's at number 18, and they beat Northwestern this past week. The Blue Devils look like a good football team. Yes, we're going to have to see them play some more high-quality opponents later in the year, but they're taking care of business. They have that Clemson win under their belt, and all Duke's got to do is just keep taking care of business, and they'll stay in the top 25 for now. Colorado's at number 19. They moved down a spot after a close encounter with Colorado State. They're rivaling the Centennial Cup. I thought that the Buffaloes were going to lose. They were down 11 late in that game, but they ended up getting to overtime and winning in double overtime. The home crowd was so excited to see a third straight win for Colorado. The primetime train is rolling, but it was ever so slightly that they could have lost that game. But they play Oregon this week, and that's another great game. All these great games I'm listing, I just cannot believe are in the exact same week of college football. I think that Colorado has a good shot to beat Oregon if they play at their best, but they're going to have to play better than they did against Colorado State if they want to have a shot. But I don't think if Colorado loses, they'll fall out of the top 25, especially if it's a close loss. But still, for now, Colorado is hanging around at number 19. Miami's at number 20. They played really well against Bethune-Cookman this past week. And the same thing with Washington State and UCLA as well. Washington State beat Northern Colorado, and UCLA beat NC Central. All of these teams took care of business. Miami's got an easy day at Temple next week. I feel like Miami should stay in the top 25 as long as they win. Washington State, they have Oregon State next week, like I've already mentioned. Both of these teams really want this win to be able to move up the Pac-12 standings and the AP top 25 poll. If Washington State loses in a close one, maybe they can stay in the top 25. But if they do get blown out, they could fall out. UCLA with Utah on the road, it's the same type thing like Washington State. If UCLA gets blown out, they could fall out of the top 25. But for now, because they won, UCLA is staying in the top 25. But the rubber's about to meeting the road for a lot of these teams, and we're going to see which team makes it out on the other side. Tennessee's at number 23 after they lost at Florida this past week. The Gators keep on beating the Volunteers. They've won 17 of the last 19 games against Tennessee, and the Volunteers have not won in the Swamp since 2003. And as you can see, when Florida, when their fans are rocking and rolling, that is one of the best environments in college football, and they really aided their team this past week. Joe Milton did not look comfortable. Tennessee, though, does have an easier game against UTSA this week. The Roadrunners have not looked like as good of a team. I feel like as long as Tennessee can win that game, they'll stay in the top 25. That is a long drop for the Volunteers, falling 12 spots in the poll, and that's really going to hurt their CFP chances. Iowa's at number 24 after they beat Western Michigan this past week. They've got a great game at Penn State this week. There you go. There's another massive showdown between top 25 teams. I cannot wait for all of these games. If Iowa loses to Penn State, they'll fall out of the top 25, especially if it's a blowout loss. But if Iowa can win, that would really propel them up the rankings. But Penn State cannot overlook the Hawkeyes, especially with that vaunted defense. But for now, because Iowa did beat Western Michigan fairly comfortably, and they even showed some offense in that game, the Hawkeyes stay in the top 25 and move up a spot. Florida is at number 25. They are the last team that was able to make the AP top 25 poll this week. They were unranked the first 2 weeks of the season, but they were able to beat their rival Tennessee last week in the Swamp, and that was a huge win, winning 29-16. Graham Mertz got the job done. The defense was fantastic. They were flying all over the field. Florida's still a really talented team. I don't know how long they're going to hang in the top 25 because of the fact Florida is such an up-and-down team. They play Charlotte next week, so as long as they win, they should stay in the top 25 unless some other teams bounce them from the other receiving votes. But it is nice for Florida Gators fans to see their team back in the top 25, especially the bleak outlook their fans had at the beginning of the season. Now, in the others receiving votes, you've got Clemson. Clemson was not able to get into the AP top 25 poll after their win this past week, but if they can knock off Florida State, they'll easily be back in the top 25. Missouri, I thought, should have made the top 25. They beat Kansas State at home this past week, and like Florida getting that big one over Tennessee, I felt that the Tigers should have entered the top 25 poll, but it is what it is. Still a lot of good teams ranked, and I can see why they didn't make it either. Kansas State fell out of the top 25. They were number 15 this past week, but since they lost to Missouri in a close one at the end of regulation with a 61-yard field goal, the longest field goal in SEC history for Missouri, Kansas State falls out of the AP top 25 poll. Then you got TCU, Fresno State, Kansas, Tulane, Kentucky, Maryland, BYU, Wisconsin, Syracuse, Louisville, and Auburn. They round out the other receiving votes. A lot of these teams are going to have big matchups coming up later on in the season that they can get in the AP top 25 poll if they start to rack up some big wins. But I'm looking forward to the week 4 games of the college football season. They're going to be some of the best games you're going to be seeing all year in college football. And you thought there was a lot of movement this week. Next week, there's going to be a lot more movement because some teams have to lose. There's going to be a lot of teams moving up and down these rankings, and they're going to have a big impact on the New Year's 6 game, the college football playoff, and just the bowl games and the top 25 rankings in general. But let me know what you guys think about this week for AP top 25 poll in college football, whether you feel like the AP voters ranked these teams where you felt that they should be after the performances that all these teams had this past week, and also what you guys think about the upcoming week 4 games in college football and how you feel that those games are possibly going to affect these rankings next week. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I will see you next time.